pushed back from inside your church, criticized for your beliefs, and told that your beliefs are too conservative, too radical, I think that is when you should leave the Anglican Communion and you should join your own, and you should become your own head of the church. 4 pieces of framing in the speech and two arguments. Firstly, in terms of framing, firstly, just some broad framing of religion. I think 3 things here. I think firstly, religions rely on followers. I think we need a lot of capital revenue. I think especially in terms of traditional settings, so things like, this is in the global south, this is things like Brazil, things like a lot of rural populations, we rely a lot on things like people going to churches, giving them donations, offering donations from like rich people there. I think secondly, we also invest a lot of limited government support in things like the US. We have things like the suppression of church and state. There's not a lot of money from the government. I think secondly, a lot of these churches rely on reputation and on actually covering up things. So for example, we can see like, for example, Catholic churches put up a lot of like historical fucked up shit that it did. I think it is similar here, but probably cover up a lot of things and rely on reputation. And I think what happens when reputation becomes tarnished or is attacked by a more liberal organization which does have access to your kind of data, does have access to your historical archives, you probably, a lot of your followers leave, a lot of media backlash happens, and probably government just shuts you down. I mean, thirdly, a lot of these organizations also rely on blind faith. A lot of these organizations do happen to be in conservative parts of society, but happen to be in parts where a lot of people grew up with their religion, where they were kind of told that religion is correct from the start. I think that goes great for the followers, but I think it goes for a lot of the leadership and people in that church as well. So I think that kind of just adds into our characterization, because we did grow up in a church. We're told this is the only correct religion, conservative part is the only correct thing. So women should not be priests, abortion should be banned, things like that from birth, and probably a lot of kind of domestic situation also reflect that as well. But also this probably means there's things like small circles. Okay, moving on to the act and what the actual interests of the act are. I think 4 things here. First of all, this act is extremely conservative. We don't agree with women leadership, we don't agree with things like abortion. We actually care a lot more about conservative ideas. For example, women not being priests. I think secondly, this act cares about getting the most amount of followers without being challenged. So for example, if you look at the American context, a lot of them are being challenged by things like the rise of religion, and obviously want to be pushed back by that. And they also want to disseminate ideas without being pushed back from both inside and outside the church. I think thirdly, they care a lot about stability and structure. First of all, 2 things here. First of all, implicitly, they probably follow the Bible letter for letter. We are a conservative stream, therefore we want to conserve the past. But I feel that's why stability is very important for them. But I think secondly, they just want to control narrative, make sure that it is their part which goes out. And thirdly, obviously they care a lot about retaining members. And fourth, they care a lot about gaining new followers and going out to new people. I think the third thing here is to just set up how they kind of marginalized and oppressed right now in the opposition's case. I think first of all, they're subject to criticism. So for example, literally in the info slide, we see the ACNA. It's not recognized by the Episcopal Church. It is not recognized by other churches, and they don't get that kind of approval. And probably we also think that the liberal churches in their sacraments, they kind of come to us, we're more liberal, we're not as bad as the other guys. I think secondly, there's quite a large kind of conservative basis people can access once they split. I think there's a lot of things like kind of Trump conservative, but also things like evangelicals who support Israel and who are more of the conservative side. I think the pressure and control from the Anglican Communion, the more liberal group just sees that first of all doesn't recognize, but also secondly, it is things like literally in another country, so it's not in the global south your leadership is. Your leadership is in England, which by itself is a much more liberal thing. But I think also just in terms of framing how the world looks like, it's probably quite a large group which we can access once they split. So first of all, a lot of Catholics, both in Brazil, but in America as well, they're kind of against the Pope, and they actually want to leave their group. I think we can see that for things like Bishop Strickland, and he was actually okay against the Pope. So the Pope said things like gay marriage should maybe become legalized. So a lot of that group actually opens up once the thing lives. I think what the problem is, I think 3 things here. I think first of all, we kind of more liberal groups take away from the message of the global South leadership. I think what we kind of can analogize it to is the Black Lives Movement, where a lot of splinter groups opened up, and some groups said right, okay, some groups said no. They just kind of splintered the message of the group. I think also a lot of open challenges to their core beliefs. And obviously these groups rely very closely on the text. I think thirdly, a lot of time and energy and efforts which we'll actually use towards conservatism is instead ways to form this kind of debate and push back from the English kind of authority. So 2 points here. First of all, in terms of freedom of religious expression, this is a more principled push, and why principally just this group will, in any case, regardless of the practical benefit, will take this support. So here, obviously, while not everyone aligns, it's just principally very unacceptable. So Hugh, the kind of context and characterization gave you, this group is very conservative. It cares a lot about their views, and it grew up with their views. Same with the leadership. It's very important for their views to be defended. So, for example, I think religious expression happens everywhere. So, for example, obviously online and freedom of religion laws is a very big principle. But I think even for this group, it is a lot more powerful and a lot more important for them. I think second, also believe that modern ideas, probably literally the people who go around and scream at women for getting abortions, go around knocking door to door because they care so much about ideas. And why they're not leading, it just hurts with freedom of religion and autonomy. I think first of all, literally the autonomy gets hurt because they're subject to the Anglican Church. They're subject to someone who's in another country. I think this is something where, just both from a principle and a practical point, where it's not in their best interest, but the best interest is to get their own autonomy. I think secondly, longer term, there's a lot of pressure piles. And third of all, I think in the long term, what we kind of solve is you can actually criticize liberal women a lot more. And the comparative is under their side. For a lot of those leaders who are more conservative, they kind of remove the Anglican leadership, and Anglican leadership just does not recognize their churches. And also now practically just why this liberal gives a whole list. I think first of all, it gives a lot more freedom for Catholics. We can actually outreach and on off. You can actually push their conservative ideas, and you don't have to be hindered by the liberal group saying, no, you can't say that, you can't be against abortion, we have to kind of follow our code. Because under our side, they actually make their own code, and they can support the ACNA a lot more. I think they can also address a lot more of the rural population. Now they can actually speak to Catholics who have been disengaged and show, no, we're not like the kind of super liberal Episcopals. We're actually like Anglican, we care a lot about the church. We actually care a lot about the Bible. I think secondly, we're probably joined forces with the ACNA. And I think why does the ACNA actually want to join them? Because ACNA, implicitly, this Global Self-Fellowship goes a lot more with the ACNA, and ACNA, just traditionally look at me, it was like, Global Self-Fellowship have always supported them, the Episcopals kind of never supported them, so basically they can actually just join up, and they can actually pull their resources for a common goal. I think thirdly, by splitting it off, it means they target people who care the most about the message, and comparative, they kind of have to do a pro-choice when target everyone. And I think what are the impacts here? 3 impacts. First of all, it just means a lot more people actually are engaged in the church, because you're now able to push your message for more. I think secondly, more broadly talked about is word of mouth, and you're not kind of lumped in for more liberal sector. You actually just can push your own conservative view. I think thirdly, you solidify power, which is the most important thing, because you can actually control your own message, and you can control who is able to come, and that is why I'm proud to.
Two things in this speech. Firstly, about how we get better resources for this particular church, and secondly, about how we get the same doctrine, if not better. But first, a couple of things instead. Broadly, what do we think the interests of the church are in this debate? We think that there are 3 interests that largely overlap with what the affirming team have given us in this debate. Firstly, that looks like money. Secondly, that looks like following, particularly in terms of following from people in the local community, but also recognition from other religious institutions. And thirdly, and finally, it looks like doctrinal purity. So, which one do we care most about in this debate? The interest that we as the church would care most about was money, because it preceded all of the other things, all of the other interests within this debate. That was to say that you could only garner a following if you were able to actively campaign, if you were able to actively fund your church. To the extent that you were able to build your churches, that was the only way that you could actually garner a following in the first place. That also extended to doctrinal purity. That was to say that if you could not expand your message to the local community, it didn't matter whether you had doctrinal purity at all. If you didn't have the resources, you didn't have this message in them. So, 2 points within this speech. Firstly, about resources, and secondly, about doctrine. On this kind of first key point around resources, there are kind of 3 key pushes in this speech. Firstly, about why the ACNA probably couldn't support itself. 2 reasons here. Firstly, it was a new sect and a new church, as acknowledged within the Episcopals. That was to say that it did not previously have a following, and it needed to work on the ground, it needed to spend a lot of capital, it needed to spend a lot of resources in order to gain that following in the first place. It was unlikely to support itself to the extent that individuals probably didn't know exactly what it stood for, and it wasn't clearly communicated within the community where this was going to happen. Secondly, it wasn't able to support itself because it wasn't a global setup. That was to say that it was unlikely that individuals within this community were going to be able to fund this church to a great extent, to the extent that they were living below the poverty line. Therefore, it meant that this new church was going to seek resources from elsewhere. We see two clear alternatives in this domain. Firstly, it is the ACNA, the American sect of the conservative movement, which the opposition acknowledges, and secondly, it is the broader Church of England and broader Anglicanism. So, why is it likely that the ACNA, which is more principally aligned with this movement, is unlikely to give them support? 4 reasons. Firstly, the ACNA has also very few resources. This is for a number of reasons. Largely, it is a smaller group. Firstly, because it is a splinter group. Secondly, because it is going against the status quo within American communities, and therefore it needs to work hard in order to gain followers in the first place. But thirdly, because a lot of conservatives are status quo biased. That is to say that they often existed in echo chambers, and to the extent that you already had your familial structures and your familial church that you went to every week, it was therefore very difficult for this conservative group, in order to extract these people out of their previous churches, to therefore go to a new conservative church. As such, we didn't think that they had a lot of resources. The second reason why the ACNA wasn't probably going to give a lot of money was isolationism. To the extent that the ACNA aligned itself very heavily with the Republican Party in the US, it was unlikely that they were going to subscribe to giving foreign aid. To the extent that the Republican Party isn't even willing to give aid to Ukraine, we think that it is unlikely that therefore they're going to extend this to the global south. Thirdly, is because the ACNA is a new organisation. This is largely an extension of the first reason that I gave you within this point, and it was difficult to get donations. Fourthly, and most importantly, the ACNA often saw liberalism as a more important sect to convert within this domain. That was to say that when liberalism was demonised, both on the right wing and within the conservative sect of the Anglican movement, they often saw it as more important to convert these individuals, to the extent that they saw it as an existential threat to their existence. When you were told that this particular movement needed to be changed, that was where they were more likely to focus. As such, they weren't going to focus on their own conservatism movements and weren't going to try and fund them. As such, we do not think the ACNA is an appropriate donor to this particular church. So, therefore, even if the ACNA is supported, we believe that the Church of England is likely to be a better supporter of this particular group. So, even if the ACNA supports, why is the Church of England and the larger Anglican movement likely to support like the donor? This is broadly because it is bigger and more established. 4 reasons. Firstly, it has established funding structures. It has existed for hundreds of years. It already has sort of multi-generational donors and family trusts that are going to give up its money again and again and again. Secondly, because it was more established, it therefore also meant that it had more wealth, but it didn't already need to show up support in the same way that the ACNA had to. It didn't need to spend resources in its local communities to try and convert people. It could instead focus elsewhere. Thirdly, it was politics. This looked like the Archbishop of Canterbury having a seat in Parliament and having the political capital in order to influence things. And fourthly and finally, it looks like more followers. That was to say that liberalism was growing, and to the extent that the Church of England aligned itself with this growing movement, it got more supporters and therefore more funding and was able to give it away. As such, at the end of the speech, we've established that the Church of England is likely to be going to be a better funding structure for this emerging church, and as such, in order to get this funding that we've established is the most important thing for this church, the church needs to align itself with. Secondly, on doctrine, which is what they push within this debate. So, why do we still think that we can have doctrinal independence even within a larger Anglican movement? 3 reasons. Firstly, there was often a lack of enforcement. That was to say that the Church of England or the larger Anglican movement wasn't sending spies down to these remote communities or these poor communities in order to establish what priests were saying. It was often the case that priests could say whatever they liked. They could cater to the local community. You could talk about conservatism, even though you yourself may not support it, and as such, they could perfectly exist and espouse these conservative values. Secondly, and this is a large migratory response, is that the church has historically been conservative. That is to say that they are not going to get alienated, they were not going to get mad to the extent that many cardinals and many bishops also probably held these beliefs as well. Thirdly and finally, we thought that the Church of England just generally loved power to the extent that they could have more reach. Even if they were finding out that these churches were conservative and didn't believe with the Church of England, they probably were going to be fine with it to the extent that it gave more power, and the Church of England was probably pretty power hungry to the extent that they have seats in Parliament. Okay, why, even if there is no doctrinal purity, doesn't it matter? Two reasons here. Firstly, even if you have a reduction in power, you can't communicate with doctrine. That is to say that even if you are doctrinally pure, it doesn't matter because under their side, you don't even communicate in the first place. Secondly, doctrinal independence is also a very personal thing. That is to say that for a lot of followers, even if this church was to espouse liberal values, they probably were going to go there anyway because they probably believed in a larger Anglicanism rather than be independent of sort of whether females should be priests or whether abortion was a right that females should have. Finally, on this freedom of religious expression that they push on their side, two responses here. Firstly, we get it for all of the reasons that I've just proven to you throughout this speech. But secondly, even if they don't, we think that this is an active debate, and to the extent that we are debating as the church probably doesn't care about whether people get religious expression or not. They are more than happy for the church to censor people who were liberal, and to the same extent that should be applied on the outside as well. We are more than happy. We don't think that the church cares about this religious expression, and as such, we're so proud to oppose.
I'd like to start by establishing that the Global South Fellowship is not a new church. They have established followers, they have established resources, and thus we simply don't believe the idea that if they separate and form their own sort of entity, that they will A, lack funding, B, sort of lack followers, or C, lack the ability to spread their message. Now, I think a key contentious issue in this debate is what actually is the purpose of the church, what do they believe in, and what do they value. We've heard from the first negative team that the interests of the church are money being the most important, then followed by, following by whether that be actual religious followers in terms of people or other institutional following, and thirdly, purity. We'd like to challenge this belief and argue that the church's primary sort of purpose, their priority, and also their role as an institution is to gain following and be a voice for those that they follow. We've heard from Nikolai at first that all of the church's power, all of their ability to actually be a church and represent their religious values stems from having following, stems from having actual people to sort of communicate with and sort of find spirituality with, and thus money is almost irrelevant in this debate when it comes to power from money or power from followers. It doesn't matter how much money you have if you don't have followers to sort of express yourself with or use this money to kind of support or gain. In this sense, we believe that the church acts as a voice for the people and that the followers are its primary priority and its primary purpose, and I'll expand upon this in my substantive. We've also heard from the first negative that we don't think that ACNA would support the church, the Global South Fellowship. This was in rebuttal to our first affirmative. We think that he didn't really mechanize why ACTA wouldn't be able to support or wouldn't want to support this on a principle level. We kind of heard that, ACNA is smaller, they're a limited sort of sector. We don't believe that this actually inhibits their ability to pair with the Global South Fellowship. We think often it is smaller communities that will band together to form a bigger entity. We think that smaller communities or smaller sort of sects are actually more likely to join with these other splintered groups to sort of build a sense of community and power and foster this sense of community, because at the end of the day, we believe that that is what the church's role is, to sort of spread their values, spread their beliefs, and foster a sense of community with their followers. We've also heard from the negative that there's almost an incentive for the Global South Fellowship to stay in the current church because they want to stop and convert liberal people and convert them to these more sort of conservative roles. We have two responses to this. Firstly, we don't believe the primary role of the church is to convert people. We think that the Global South Fellowship will prioritize its actual existence as a sort of union and as a community, as opposed to, converting people. And converting people is important, but we think that a lot of people are very set and firm in their religious views. We think it's unlikely for the church to sort of move people who are really set to sort of conservatism to sort of come over like to liberal and vice versa, and thus we believe that the church in this sort of very highly disruptive splintered environment will focus on the followers that they already have and will want to prioritize the existing followers, and to so prioritize these existing followers, it is vital to move out of the Anglican Communion, which I will also sort of expand upon in my substantive. Quickly regarding the substantive from First Ned about the same sort of doctrine, and that they'll have a reduction of power moving, they won't be able to sort of communicate this doctrine. We simply don't believe this is like true. The concept of money, we think that it's acts of services that really can communicate strength and value. We think they have existing followers, they have words of mouth, and it is these loyal existing followers that will lead to the spreading of their doctrine and their continued existence as an organisation. And lastly, just the concept from First Name that the church doesn't care about religious expression. We just think this is completely false. We think that churches exist because of religious expression. That is how churches come to be. Churches come to be because they have certain views of, in this case, the Bible. They have their opinions about religious expression, and they exist because they want to stress their religious sort of expression. If religious expression didn't matter to the church, then we feel like this debate really wouldn't exist, and why would there be so many issues with conservatism versus liberalism? So we just don't believe this sort of point or this ideal stands. So now on to my substantive. I'd like to focus on how the church's role is to provide a safe place for followers. We see the church as an institution is a voice for the people it represents, and at its core, the church exists to represent their people and their values. So in the status quo, we believe that followers of the Global South Fellowship may feel, say, ostracized when going to church by these strong liberal views that are in opposition to their values, and they might feel, because of this, a sense of shame, a sense of doubt, or a sense of like a lack of belonging on a general level. Just as we believe that, say, if you're a minority community, say at uni, in a classroom and you're having a discussion, and your view opposes the majority view of really loud, huge voices, you may feel uncomfortable, you may feel unlikely to share your opinion, and you might feel just a lack of belonging, and we think this is really in opposition to the core values that religion holds. Religion is all about finding a sense of belonging, finding value in sort of a joint community, finding spirituality, and we believe that people with followers don't feel safe in this kind of environment, that the church has then failed its role. And so thus, under our case, or in the negative team's case, followers, we believe, may leave the Global South Fellowship because they feel the church no longer represents their values, because they feel ostracized in this community, or alternatively, they may fear that if the church doesn't separate and become a strong entity that sort of pushes their values, that they may leave in fear of the church becoming a more liberal entity. And so thus, these are the sort of three reasons why we think that the church is very likely to lose followers if the negative team's case is upheld. And as Nikolai at first sort of stressed the importance of followers, and because it is the role of the church to represent their followers, I've established through the rebuttal that under the affirmative team's case, we believe that followers is the primary importance of the church, not money, as the negative team may lead you to believe, that it is absolutely in the church's best interest to sort of leave and become their own individual entity. And so with this, we have 4 reasons why it is clearly in the Global South Fellowship's best interest to leave the communion. That is to 1, better represent their followers by upholding the views and values of these followers. 2, to provide a safe place for their followers, as I've recognized under the status, if the Global South Fellowship is to stay in the Anglican Communion, we believe that they will lose followers, A, because of the followers' fear of sort of representing themselves in the church, or B, fear of the church becoming more sort of liberal and not aligning with their views. The third reason why it's vital for the Global South Fellowship to leave the Anglican Communion is to foster an environment of free religious expression, which we believe is a key principle in this debate that must be sort of given high weighting and high value. This is a very principled thing. Everyone has a freedom of expression. We think this should also apply to religious expression, and we believe that this religious expression will be detrimented if the Global South Fellowship, as the actor in this debate, does not leave the Anglican Communion. And finally, to remain cohesive as a church that has a sense of autonomy and a sense of value, to remain cohesive as a union, as a church, it is vital that they sort of have their own entity, and whether they then in the future combine with other smaller entities, as Nikolai stated, this is sort of a vital part of their organic growth as organic themselves, and this is why we are very proud to affirm. Ready for this one?
I think the reason that this negative team falls down is they don't really concretize what the benefits of staying are, and even at the point in which you believe they do. The best case version of this is that they explain that they get access to more capital and resources on their side. Firstly, leave it on that metric because we explain that one, we are actually able to put more capital and resources and use them with autonomy on our side is where you get the most benefit for the church. Noting this is an active debate. So whether or not you believe the interest is about money or following or whatever, noting it should obviously be followers, because I can build a really nice church, but if no followers want to come and worship in, that's kind of redundant, isn't it? Obviously, that point would win. But I think the other reason we are able to come up over this negative team in this debate is we provide a series of very certain impacts that are not contingent necessarily on whether or not we gain capital. Firstly, we explain you can disseminate your message more clearly and with more power and authority, which is how you gain followers, how you gain capital and money. Secondly, you have more autonomy, and we say first, to little to no response to this negative team. Thirdly, we explain you get a more loyal following base who actually identify with your message. But fourthly, you consolidate your power. That is what churches care about. Everything else aside, they care about being powerful, they care about indoctrinating their followers and then spreading the message outwards. That is what you uniquely achieve on-site affirmative. That is why we already beat this negative team. I'm going to do two things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to respond to the idea of capital and resources and explain why this is actually far better on our side. Noting it was too late for third negative to respond to the autonomy mechanism that we give you at first because it's not got a response yet in the debate. Secondly and finally, I will explain doctrinal integrity and explain to you that why that is far worse on their side. That is detrimental to the church as an actor. Firstly, we're going to push the second negative, which is about the loss of support from the Anglican Communion specifically and why that is bad. First thing to say, in the status quo, I don't think there is much existing support because the splintering is already happening empirically. Look at the way that other liberal churches are failing to even recognize conservative sex. Also, again, to little to no response, we explain there is already organic change and preferences in certain contexts towards more liberal sex religion. That therefore means that conservative versions of religion already feel slightly ostracized and need independent space so they can worship and express their views freely. Second, even if you're willing to concede that the global fellowship is somewhat small and without the Anglican community they do have somewhat less capital, that activates the harm that we give you at Nicolai's speak, that they have a lack of autonomy and bargaining power under the umbrella of the Anglican Church. That applies not only how they use their resources and capital, but that also applies to things like what kind of sermons are they delivering, what kind of messaging are they doing. That meant they do not have doctrinal integrity, therefore also co-opting their benefit they try and claim onto our side. I'll get into more of that in my second issue. The second thing I want to address under the idea of capital and resources, I just don't think this negative team has officially proven they actually get more resource under their side, noting that in the status quo, in the info slide, it clearly says there is not much support for this conservative section of the church. The liberal portion of the Anglican Church are trying to do more liberal policies, and the conservative church is literally wasting their resources that is true. Firstly, this relies on the fact that this church is a new church, as I said, empirically untrue. Secondly, conservative religious values have been around for like thousands of years, and in the US context specifically, seeing the prominence of the Republican Party, they are probably set to win the next election. We know that this kind of context are actually quite conservative states, therefore those churches are far better. But in preemption, where the third name is going to run, obviously even if that conservatism exists, it's very clear there still is a massive liberal push. And when you have splintering in that church and you're unable to convey your message without sway or influence of any external liberal forces, you're far better to splinter off and be your own church where you can pull in those capital and resources and use it freely. But thirdly, as Nikolai explains, in the context of the US, there are lots of other entry points for donation capital, as I've already explained. But I think the next question to then ask under this issue of capital and resources is why we think it is just like the global fellowship would pull resources to people like ACNA. Firstly, doctrinal similarity. They probably are likely to do that for that mechanism. But secondly, for the retention of power, that is probably particularly important. And I think just a few final things here on like structural reasons why the global fellowship does have existing resources, and I think this just takes like the benefit they can to the case on our debate. Firstly, info side. Secondly, they have partnerships already with institutions like ACNA, noting that those institutions are uniquely recognized by people like the global fellowship, so they probably do already have quite a good long-standing relationship. But thirdly, I think existing followers already provide capital. They do things like run the bake sales, attend the sermons, they go and do door knocking and things like that. These are mechanisms we've already given you down the bench to concretize the fact that two things at the end of that issue. Firstly, you have to believe that this church has the ability to stand on its own, it has the capital, religion's been around for thousands of years, it's not going anywhere, but we're still able to win on that issue, even if you believe that initially they will have less capital as the negative team tries to contend incorrectly. But all the mechanisms and reasoning and characterization we have provided you suggest they are able to build up that capital and use it in a free and autonomous way. That was a unique benefit that only Southern Birmingham can claim. Finally, on doctrinal integrity, three kind of key responses to this issue. Firstly, in the status quo, I think whilst there is a presence of conservative values, they are undermining preference liberal views. Look at the ostracization ACNA from the liberal church. But secondly, because of the reputational mechanism we give you at Nikolai, which is literally unresponded to, this explains why the liberal sects would apply pressure to ACNA to like conform to their views, because obviously they want to see more liberal, like that's in their view, even if it's not the conservative church's view. But thirdly, existing splintering demonstrates a lack of doctrinal integrity, which is bad, because the importance of this issue is that under their side, they're not able to deliver their message in a way that they can, A, keep existing followers who are worried that they're going to like, become more liberal, and then those followers leave because those followers actually care and are deeply entrenched in their conservative values, or alternatively, they just feel a bit of lost faith. At the end of this, what you must believe, this is an active debate. Therefore, we are the team who not only get more followers to this church, as more access to capital, we're able to do it freely and in line with our own values. We've never been prouder to do that.
That by nature, conservatives did not care about criticism. By their own example, the reason the Black Lives Matter movement was unsuccessful with conservatives was because they were already racist and clearly very okay with that given the extreme backlash they faced in society. The reason criticizing a conservative's view on abortion didn't convert them to liberalism was because they were stuck in the past, they lived in echo chambers in communities around the world. To that extent, I think at the end of this debate, we conclude that conservatives were very unreceptive to criticism. It only made them louder, it only made them more angry, more explicit, and consequently only spread their message more. Therefore, we conclude by saying that if they can get more money and get more power under our side, then clearly that was in their best interest because they did not care about all of the stuff the affirmative team wanted to talk about in the first two speeches. I'm going to deal with two things in this debate. Firstly, on doctrinal purity, and secondly, on the ability to gain resources and followers for the church, etc. The push on doctrinal purity is to say that conservatives care about having power and autonomy over their message. A few responses to this. The first thing is to say is that the way religions function is to gain power through things like resources and money, which they get through followers. To that extent, conservatives do not care about pushing their message with equally conservative people
We've proved why people are unlikely to move over during this splintering. That was because conservatives were biased to the status quo. They were clearly very unreceptive to change in society. The second thing was that they knew the splinter group was smaller and had less resources, so they were unwilling to move with them because of that lack of power. And thirdly, and I think extremely importantly, conservatives had a lot of incentives to stay in the bigger church and try to convert liberals. That was literally their goal. You can't buy their push that religions don't care about converting followers. That is literally how they function. To that extent, I think it's more likely that conservatives care about pushing their sentiment outside of these echo chambers that they already exist in. But let's analyse both scenarios. I think the first thing that could happen is they split off to be able to spread their message with other conservatives. The reasons we told you that this can't happen is because firstly, the lack of resources. Secondly, it was a small group by nature, so they probably didn't need to push their message, but even if they tried to, it wasn't going to get out very far in society. But thirdly, by nature of leaving, you have isolated yourself. People are going to be unwilling to listen to what you want to say. The second alternative is that they stay in the church and spread their message there. The affirmative push here is to say no, but that's made hard by the fact that criticism exists. Panel no, as I flagged in my introduction, these people thrive off debate, they thrive off discourse, they refer to the Black Lives Matter movement. The reason conservatives were so vocal, even given the backlash, was the fact that they, and the backlash, it was like had an extremely high burden. They may have lost their jobs, they might have lost like friends and family and things like that, but they continue to hold their sentiment. That was because they cared so deeply about their own thoughts and their own values that this criticism just didn't faze them whatsoever. They probably just did not care. But also, I want you to note the way that society perceives conservatives. That is through a very negative lens. And this is a new response, and I think needs to be weighed extremely highly. Because I think to the extent that society views conservatives as extremely racist and extremely misogynistic people, then it was probably very vital that these conservatives did stay with the church and did have discourse and debate. Because to the extent that people viewed them as very insular and like unapproachable and having very old views, it was unlikely that they were ever going to join the church themselves when they did splinter off. And I think this responds to Third Act, who says, no, liberals are also stuck in their ways and unlikely to convert. We're able to gain the number of people who weren't in the Anglican Church to begin with and now can be converted. And I think this is extremely important given the fact that society only becomes more progressive. I think to that extent, it's unlikely that you find new conservatives who aren't already in the church based on demographic and family ties and all of those things. So to gain followers, you must have productive debate with people of differing views. And I think there's a last-ditch effort to then respond in the second half by saying, no, churches don't care about converting people, they just care about their own message. Obviously that was untrue for all of the analysis they give about needing resources, needing money, and needing power. The way they got that was by having followers of their church, by people donating, and all of those sorts of things. But even if you did buy that this noise was so destructive that the conservatives did have to leave, I think A, it was way harder to practice your doctrinal purity without support and without resources. But also, you could practice doctrinal purity on a very personal level, which got no response. We told you that looked like donating to existing conservative powers, doing good things for social justice in the society. It looked like attending churches. Note that they could still attend different churches like the conservatives and the liberals. And I think this is especially true given they're probably quite geographically different and segregated into communities and things like that. They say that the conservatives are small within the Anglican Church and therefore have no autonomy. Two responses to this. First thing to say is that the Anglican Church didn't want the conservatives to leave. It meant they lost followers. It meant they also had a decrease in power and all of those things. And to that extent, I think the conservatives were able to extract a lot of concessions from the Anglican Church in this instance. That looked like the Anglican Church giving them money, letting them be conservative, letting them practice their doctrinal purity that the affirmative team wants to claim, for all of the reasons that it was not in the Anglican Church's best interest either to have them leave. Okay, now let's deal with this push on resources and the ability to grow as a church. I think the question that needs to be asked here is, will the ACNA support this splinter group? We told you no. The affirmative team just tells you no, but they have moral incentives to support this splinter group because they're morally aligned. Obviously, it didn't matter that they had these moral incentives if it didn't materialize in any actual benefit for them. The response is extremely mitigatory to tell me that they want to help them because they have the same values. Obviously, if they didn't have enough money to help them, then I literally did not care whether they liked them or not. We gave you many reasons why the ACNA would be unlikely to help these groups. That was because they were isolationists, they were racist. The ACNA already had low resources, and won't want to give them to the global south for all of the reasons we've already told you. But thirdly, and importantly, we told you that they were very small by nature. We told you they were a splinter group, that they went against the status quo, that they were going to be biased against that they had existing family ties in the conservative church. They say, no, this is untrue. There are lots of conservatives in America, therefore the ACNA is very big. No, this is untrue because all of those conservatives are probably in like Catholic or evangelical churches, not in this splinter group of the ACNA. That's why you couldn't claim all the conservatives in America because they weren't even in the Anglican Church to begin with. The only response from the affirmative team here is again to say the ACNA had moral reasons to join with them. Obviously that didn't matter if it could not materialise. But then why at the end of this debate, and I'm going to do some very explicit and important weighing, why are resources way more important than any doctrinal purity in this debate? Firstly, because people didn't care about spreading views in a vacuum. Secondly, because they wanted the church to continue to exist. Obviously the church having an existence in the first instance was the #1 priority for these groups. And money was a precondition to existing, obviously. That's why being able to access money, access power, access resources when you split it off was a precondition to all of the benefits the affirmative team wants to talk about in this debate for doctrinal purity. But thirdly, because of corruption of religious leaders. Obviously money was so important to religious leaders. The idea of heaven or hell seems so far away and so disconnected from them, if they even did believe in that obviously the immediate access to money and that immediate benefit was so much more important. So proud of you.
Okay, hi everyone, thank you all very much for the debate. We both agreed that was an incredibly close debate. I think the debate was done at a very high quality as well. We'll do some general feedback, we'll announce the result, we'll go through the reasons for the result. A couple of general feedback. I think the first thing here is there's a heap of talk in today's debate about money and resourcing, etc. That becomes a key issue in the debate, as we can explain later, but I'm still a bit unclear as what does the money do? Where does money come from? How does the financial structure of the various churches work? In such a way as does the CFE just pass it all the way down to the global south, wherever it operates, so they collect locally, etc. So obviously we judge the debate on how the teams presented, which seems to be this idea that you share and gain resources from each other, but I'm just a bit really unclear on how that operates secondly as well, overall as well. Secondly, I think a lot more could be done about with this doctrine, I'll talk about importance of doctrine from both teams here, with regards to the breaching doctrine in a religious sense. And to be clear, I'm not a religious person, but it's the consequence is hell, right? And that seems pretty bad for breaching doctrine and for pushing people away, etc. So I think a lot more could be made from both teams about amping up the importance of this and why it is so critical to apply or not apply to doctrine, etc. The third thing I think would be more interesting to hear about in this debate was a bit more about the power play between the various factions. A bit of this debate is unclear about what the lay of the land is at the moment between the various groups. They haven't separated yet, but obviously the motion exists because there's some consideration of it, or there's some split. So what is the power play? Where are we up to in these debates? Who is doing what? I think could have helped explain a bit more about where the lay of the land is now, which helps, I guess, make the comparative a little bit clearer for what's going to actually happen going forward. In terms of saying that, though, it was a very, very good debate. I think we ultimately ended up not being able to reach a consensus within the decision. That's fair to say, right? Yeah. So it ended up being the chair's decision, which is my casting vote. So on a very narrow margin, the debate was awarded to side negative. Congratulations. Well done to both teams. I do want to emphasise how close and interesting this debate was. I'm going to start, I think the issue is the biggest turning point for me, and then explain how the rest of the issues fit around that. I want to start with this idea of freedom of expression and doctrinal, etc. Because I think AF starts very strong in their case, explaining why it is super important to have access to your expression, to spread your own doctrine, because it feels like it's what you're connected to, and you don't want to be you want to have that autonomy to express your religion in the way you want to, and why that's particularly important for these groups going forward. And there might be issues around abortion or gay marriage, etc., that compromise that doctrine. The problem I have with this is that I think affirmative, the actual lay, how that is concretized then into an actual harm on the day-to-day operations of the Global South Fellowship is the bit I'm unclear on from side affirmative today, as to what power does it have to entrench in them, what are the actual policies that are in place that is hurting this church, and if all those things are so doctrinally separated, why are they not already separated, or why is this tipping point now? This is where I think negative does do some pretty good material. There's, I think, unfortunately goes unresponded to from side affirmative. That slips in here to explain why the actual day-to-day operation of that doctrine is not likely to be interrupted at the moment. The first being that maybe not the strongest mechanism, but they can't send spies, so they don't know what they're doing. But I think the stronger materials are, one, that the separation of these groups from a geographical sense, they're not involved in them significantly. Secondly, there's lots of incentives on the broader church, the broader Anglican Communion, the COE, etc., to not want to have the church separate and break away because it hurts its own power. It doesn't want to have the image issues, it doesn't want to have the splintering issues. And thirdly, that for lots of faith and doctrines, their capacity to preach their own stuff and to operate in their own ways doesn't seem to be massively infringed by these groups. So I think at this point then, and also just the limited reach and the capacity of the power of the big church to get to every church or to every version of that around the world is particularly limited too. I think at this point then, I'm not necessarily convinced by Neg that these are the strongest reasons why you have complete doctrinal freedom, but I think they present enough of a suggestion that you can actually go about your day-to-day existence with this without a huge amount of change. And I think without a clearer picture from AF as to what exactly the day-to-day problem is that means we can't function in a way that allows that autonomy, or without a direct set of responses to those claims that aren't just autonomy is really important, I think it's unable to flip that towards AF. So I think Neg is able to show in this point then that the actual doctrinal threat, at least at the point now it is, as the info slide suggests, where there's debate and discussion about these reforms, isn't a massive threat to these groups. Which then I think changes the questioning of resources, etc. Because if resources become marginal, or you flip either way on this, but there isn't a massive change on doctrinal expression, I think that makes a big impact on later issues. But so on the first point there, not a massive change on doctrinal influence. Let's then look at the resourcing question overall. This one, I think, again, this issue is not hard to judge, but the importance of it is difficult because it's I'm not sure exactly what we do with these resources. The best picture we get from Neg is they can pay for TV ads and radio ads to go out and proselytize or build nicer churches, etc. Not entirely sure how that happens. How nice the churches think massively depends on the Lutheran King revolution of gold-plated churches and whatever. But that's way above my standard knowledge of religion or the OIV, I think. In any case, though, I think what AF ultimately is able to successfully do in this issue is push back on this idea that it'd be nothing coming from joining with ACNA and the rest of them, because there is an existing church, there would be some degree of funding, some degree of support membership there. So I'm not convinced there'll be a devastation that Neg kind of points out. But I think what Neg's able to do on the resourcing question is push together that there is likely to be, so he's able to push there's likely to still be a bigger group when you side with the traditional conservative, so the traditional Church of England group, more global operation, more well-established operation, operating from countries that are likely to be wealthier, have wealthy donations, etc. And those pre-established links are likely to all fund UN better, but also even some parts of that are liberalising to some extent. They capture a whole new market of donations in other churches and other groups of the world from capturing that new liberalised market that means that this church can benefit more financially from that than one in which is from the poor regions of the world, newer church, but also one that if becoming more objectively and conservatively stronger is less likely to attract a growing progressive or growing liberalising base of followers as well. So I think in terms of the resourcing question, I think there's probably an example shows likely to get more access to resources from sticking with the traditional existing structures than you are to go out with your own. The other thing that you do is I think this question of how big or how supportive ACNA is, I think also Neg has some good stuff at first about why ACNA is likely to be unable to financially support all of this. I think it's also a bit of a floating question for me, at least, of which is the bigger one, the Global South Fellowship ACNA, who's actually has the capacity to support who. But I think they show that they're more to do that. The only other response I want to mention from HAF is this idea we get a second that a lot of smaller groups can band together and can outweigh the group of the top. But I think the problem there is I don't know who all these small groups are and why they're likely to, how big they're going to be, how much success they're going to have. So I think conceptually could work. I don't think it's explained enough in this debate as to why these groups would match that size, or that there are sufficient numbers of these groups, because all the examples I know of in the debate are this Global South, ACNA, and the COE above them all. So on resourcing then, I think Neg wins that, and then the flow and impacting that both teams agree on about using resources to gain followers, I think then flows on to Neg. Which brings us into this last question around followers. Big question here of where do they go and who are we targeting here? I think here, the problem with followers from AF is that the risk of losing existing conservative followers because it is liberalising, is somewhat contingent upon that first question of how much of a threat are these churches under at the moment, and if they're not under a significant threat of the doctrine being changed and the way they operate, then I don't think they're likely to lose as many of those conservative followers anyway. But I think, as is also pointed out, a lot of those deeply conservative followers believe a lot of that really strict doctrinal stuff, as Neg points out, are probably already likely to be Catholics. So I think there's a huge group that are moving significantly in that sense then. I think Neg also posits some reasons as to why, even in the worst case, the church does liberalise to some extent, a bunch of people aren't going to leave the church in numbers that we're concerned about. That being that conservative members, I guess not a religious but a general conservative sense, don't like change, don't like to move between churches, are happy to stay and support that church they're in, but also secondly they like to push and change for, continue to be in that debate and push for changes and support what they want to exist anyway, but also thirdly, that they're unlikely in either world to gain across new liberals coming across to the church if they go to a more conservative bloc. So I don't think a huge amount of more followers are gained by this separation, but potentially because people are entrenched and like and support the existing structures they're in, might be lost in the transition that happens when they break across. The very last thing, and possibly an odd way to structure this whole adjudication, is just to discuss the priority of this actor and what they care most about, because there's a bit of a fight, particularly in the middle of the debate, around this idea of money versus followers. Ultimately, I don't think this issue is hugely decisive for either team, so it becomes just a rolling chicken and egg problem of which one feeds the other one. I'm ultimately convinced that both are particularly important and both help the other one. You get money to get followers, but followers give you money to get you more followers. So I'm not sure either team ultimately wins that, but all their arguments ultimately support both of those goals being achieved. And I don't think there's a massive sort of opportunity cost presented between the teams that means one must massively be prioritised over the other, considering both of them mutually help each other. And I think more decisively in the debate is that question of how much is the system under threat, and comparing that to the resourcing outcome. So that is ultimately why in a close call Neg wins the debate. I hope that all made sense. Very happy to chat to teams for feedback. But I do know I think we're running late on schedule, so we need to head back to the briefing room so we can walk and talk. But well done guys, best of luck for the rest of these things.